A recent crackdown on underground churches in China has led to the arrest of dozens of pastors and ministers, including prominent figures from the Zion Church network. The Chinese government is increasingly suppressing independent religious groups, requiring registered churches to display pro-government banners and installing surveillance cameras. Unregistered or house churches, like Zion, which grew in part by using online services and offline groups, are being targeted with closures and arrests, and that's led to international calls for the release of those who have been detained. So we're sitting here today with Professor Lian, a professor of world Christianity at Duke University's Divinity School, and also a young visiting scholar at the Harvard Divinity School this year. And we're talking with him today to try to understand the rise of religion in China, and particularly Christianity in China, and what this crackdown means. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Lian.
Thank you for having me.
Let's jump in with, the first question is really about the rise of Christianity. What do you think are the main reasons that there's been such a rise in, firstly, religion writ large over the last several decades in China, but more specifically Christianity? And why are people drawn to the underground or the house churches, despite the risks, because they are considered to be, I guess, illegal?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, the rise of Christianity and other religions, or the revival of religion, has been a post-Mao phenomenon, and so in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, and with all the devastations and all that, there was this real sort of a crisis of belief, which the party also acknowledged starting in the 1980s. So the revival of religion should really be traced back to the 1980s, and certainly with all forms of religion, but Christianity has seen a spectacular, sort of explosive growth in the 1980s and 1990s, and continuing into this century. So, of course, there are many reasons for that, but I think that sense of crisis, of belief, what do you believe in? Confucianism had already been over the previous decades, has been discredited very much and by the state, and starting in the May 4th era, and the Mao's revolution did a lot to further undermine traditional religion. And then communist belief, communist ideology itself became a bankrupt faith, at least at the popular level. And so there was nothing there to fill that void, and religion, and in this case, Christianity, was able to step into that void, to fill that void rather. And but when it comes to the question about underground faith, underground Christianity versus state-sanctioned Christianity, we have to look back to the beginning of state-sanctioned church called the Three Self Church, going all the way back to the 1950s. It was the new communist government's attempt to impose very strict control of religion, of Christianity, which had this problematic ties to the West. And so that has always been the case with the state-sanctioned church, very tight-lit on Christianity, its personnel, its theology, and everything. And then came the Cultural Revolution, when when the government tried to wipe out all forms of religion, and particularly targeting Christianity. And then in the after Mao, in late 1970s, Christianity was allowed to be brought back, but again, the government reimposed that structure, that control, through the Three Self mechanism. So
And was there something in that Three Self mechanism that meant you had to also be a loyal communist?
Well, the leaders would have to be trusted by the party, which means that they don't have the trust of the believers. And so that's a problem, the problem of authenticity. And many of the leaders in the Three Self Church had themselves have made compromises during the Cultural Revolution. So a lot of them have lost that credibility with believers. And then the continuing practice under very tight government control also posed a problem for the church. So the Three Self Church has been wrestling with the problem of credibility ever since. And so a lot of people, including, you mentioned the Zion Church, its leader, Ezra Jin Minri, he started in the Three Self churches in the 1990s, but then he found it unsatisfying and left that church eventually to found his own church. So I think the greatest reason for people joining the Three Self Church is to find what they believe to be more authentic.
To join the underground,
to join the house
yeah.
church or the unregistered church is to find a more authentic, a freer form of religion.
And how much of a risk, are they aware of the fact that there's a risk in joining that? Is there a danger factor, or people don't really think about that when they join the underground church?
Well, things have changed over the past 3 or 4 decades. For a period of time, there were scholars who said, don't mention underground church anymore because they are not underground. And that's true. In the early 2000s, for instance, many churches would go, they never wanted to be, did not want to be underground. They rented office space. The Zion Church rented their office space on the 3rd floor, so it's not underground, and they rented a space that was previously used by a nightclub, and they got this space that holds 500 people for their Sunday worship. So for a time being, it was not underground.
Would that have been in the early 2000s?
Early 2000s,
yeah.
and even in the late 1990s, and in some cases continuing today. To some extent, it is not underground. It is unregistered. But the risk has always been there to a varying extent, and it also varies from region to region. In some of the more urban areas like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, things used to be a little bit more open, but the risks have intensified in the Xi Jinping era.
Right. I was just going to ask you, something changed. So I'm wondering, and you mentioned during the Xi Jinping era, what is it that the government fears in this independent underground church? I mean, is it somehow, a threat? Does it pose a threat in some way to the values of the Communist Party or to the government or whatever? What's the government afraid of?
Well, the Chinese church, by and large, have been apolitical. And in fact, including the Zion Church, they don't want to take they don't want to get involved directly in political issues, although inevitably they become political in almost by default. And so, for the government, it is not that there were any signs of these unregistered churches, underground churches, organizing any subversive political action against the government. It's not that. I think it's the fact that the government recognized the potential in Christianity, and particularly underground Christianity, to undermine its rule. And that fear, that concern actually goes all the way back to early 1980s. Even when China was opening up, that was the most open era, at the beginning of the Deng Xiaoping reform era. The solidarity movement in Poland alarmed the top leadership, even as they were in the process of opening up religion. They already pointed to the fact that this can pose a threat. But then, of course, they recognized there's a basic reality here with Christianity, more than other religion, because Islam is more regional, it's more regionalized and is localized and has connected with ethnic identity on that and all that. With Christianity, the party recognized that it has a completely different set of, it's a completely different belief system. It has a completely different set of values that are at odds with the values that the party championed. For instance, the Xi Jinping era, this great Chinese dream of rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, that may be its values. I mean, it's its own set of values, but the values that Christianity has introduced is completely different. It introduced transcendent values. Even back in the 1980s, Liu Xiaobo, who was the first.
Liu Xiaobo, let me just define, who was an independent intellectual who won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And died in prison.
That's right. Eventually became the Nobel Peace Laureate. Mm-hmm. But even back in the late 1980s, he pointed out that only Christianity brings transcendent values. And that's in contrast to the Chinese, the party ideology, but also in contrast to the Chinese tradition, the Confucian tradition particularly, which does not have that transcendent value.
What do you mean by transcendent value? Because wouldn't Buddhism, for example, have transcendent values?
Yes, Liu Xiaobo also recognized that, but he said Christianity, more than other religions, introduced these transcendent values. And for instance,
what kinds of things? Yeah.
Yes, and the kind of repentance, that individuals need and society needs, and so that is one problem for the Communist Party because its own set of values. Another problem, another potential threat to the communist rule is that the basic fact that we here take for granted, which is Christianity is a congregational religion, while Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, they're not. And which means Christianity has this unusual ability to mobilize people. Its organizational capacity, its ability to mobilize people. Elizabeth Perry has mentioned that the Chinese society, in modern times, we see this lack of cross-class mobilization, ability to have this cross-class mobilization. During the Tiananmen events leading up to Tiananmen massacre, what really alarmed the government was when students, as you know, students started to connect with the workers. That's cross-class mobilization. And Chinese intellectuals, today even, they don't have the capacity. You have the elite, they don't have the capacity for that cross-class mobilization. But when you look at churches like Jiminri's Zion Church and other churches like that, it has membership drawn from different ranks, different classes, different regions of China. And there's an inherent ability for their cross-class and cross-region, mobilization. Liu Xiaobo wrote a book called 未来的自由中国在民间, pointing to civil society as where you will find real freedom.
The future of civil society is in the people.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, 在民间. And then he compares different civil society, different groups that can serve, that can play this role of civil society. The first thing that comes to mind, independent political party. China did have one, China Democracy Party, that was swiftly crushed by the state. And you can have environmental groups. You can have independent think tanks. You can have book clubs. But when we look back now at those groups, and even Liu Xiaobo wrote this a long time ago, he already said that these groups, they may provide possibility for civil society, but none of that compared with religion, particularly Christianity. And I think again, because of its inherent ability, because of its congregational nature, its ability to mobilize people.
Let's go back to the question of values that you talked about. We've seen 4 decades, basically, of economic reform in China, but no corresponding liberalization of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what kind of impact that has had on the ethical and moral foundations of Chinese society. You also mentioned, of course, the culture. You can't not talk about the Cultural Revolution, which destroyed so much in terms of values, et cetera, and people emerged from that time not knowing what to believe in anymore. But I'm wondering if you see a kind of a moral or spiritual void in China, partly as a result of the fact that it's been all about economic development, money, but kind of a lack of opening in the social and political arena.
Yes. I think that the fact that there has not been a comparable set of reforms in the political arena alongside economic reforms, even in the best years of economic reform, there has not been the liberalization and other developments that would have contributed to some kind of shared values of society. I think that certainly has been a problem. But I think the larger problem with that collapse of the communist ideology and the fact that there's nothing that has been able to has filled that space, that gap. I think that poses really a most fundamental kind of problem. As you know, in our time, the top leadership, and particularly in the Xi Jinping era, has tried to use nationalism as a new ideology to mobilize people. But I think there are limits to what nationalism can do as an ideology, as a belief system. As you know, in our time, with all the economic woes and employment problems, even that the nationalism, it's the call of rejuvenation and all this show of Chinese economic and military might cannot answer to people's concerns about their livelihood, about their job security, about their retirement, their health concerns, their child care worries and all that. So there are limits to that. And I think for many people, a transcendent set of belief system, it can be Buddhism and folk religion in various forms, but certainly Christianity has been able to provide that kind of belief system.
I wonder if the Chinese government could look at Christianity as a positive force in terms of helping people, helping to fill this moral and ethical gap, and helping to shape individuals' sense of justice, meaning, of purpose, etc. I wonder is the church playing that role right now for people? And I wonder if the government is missing an opportunity, in a sense, in not seeing that positive role.
Well, in fact, back in the 1990s, the churches were already trying to present to the government, to convince the government of the usefulness that Christianity can be very useful to the socialist modernization. Because Christianity can help us become better citizens with a greater sense of social responsibility and do work of love. And there are scholarly works that have said that the Christian idea of love may have contributed to some of the new language that's being adopted in official media. to promote harmony, particularly to promote love. And then, as you know, in the wake of the Sichuan earthquake, 2008, Christian churches were among the first to mobilize relief efforts, independent, 民间 relief efforts, and with even greater credibility than the Chinese, the Red Cross.
Right, right. Until then, the massive kind of, rise of public service or whatever following the earthquake, and then the government became suspicious and skeptical because people started asking too many questions.
That's right. So then they told the churches, you can donate money, but you cannot organize anything.
So what do you think young people believe in China these days? I'm curious as to, if traditional faith and communist ideology have really collapsed, what shapes their values and ethics?
Certainly, religion has always been there, and traditional values, Confucian values, that have lived on in family. I think that's still there, and so we must not underestimate the power of religion to shape young people's belief system. I also want to mention a recent survey by the Pew Research done by Pew that came out just in this past summer, which paints quite a stark picture of secularization globally and also in China. But in the case of China, they use a different criterion, a very narrow criterion to measure religiosity, particularly using this notion of this criterion of religiously affiliated or unaffiliated. So using that criterion, the Pew research found that 90% of Chinese population is unaffiliated. Either it has no religious affiliation, which I think risks seriously underestimating the extent to which religion continues to influence people's thinking. So, and of course, there are the religious belief has been carried on at various levels. At a very basic level, when you're sick, you go to pray, you go to temple to pray, or you pray for good examination results or job application and all that. So in this market, religious market, I think Christianity, particularly in this Protestant form, is quite a vital force. In terms of our belief system. And
I wonder if this whole kind of Tongping phenomenon, it seems like there's something different happening among young people today. I mean, particularly the Tongping thing, you could say it's because of economic slowdown, people can't find jobs, and it's about that. But it seems like there's something more going on, that a lot of young kids or young people are saying, no, I don't want to be part of that rat race.
Yes.
I don't want to be part of that thing that my parents have been forcing on me, race, money, achieve. And maybe that is a reflection of looking for something else, looking for something broader, some other meaning to life.
Well, Tongping, at the very least, is a sign that people are no longer satisfied with the kind of narrative, the kind of that the party tries to promote, and the kind of secular material pursuits, right? But I suspect it may also be a relatively transient phenomenon, because Tongping does not offer any way out.
True.
Your savings will run out eventually, right?
True.
So for the time being, I've just lost this drive to play the kind of game that everybody has been forced to play. But I think eventually it's going to be a higher kind of pursuit that would inspire these people. And
my last question is about the book that you wrote called Blood Letters, in which you detail Lin Zhao's life and spiritual resistance. First, tell us briefly, if you could, who Lin Zhao was and why she was important, and what does her story tell us about the unique role of Christianity in dissent and the development of a sense of conscience in China?
Well, I'll try to make it brief. She was a poet. She was for a time, she was a journalist.
Mm-hmm. This is before the Cultural, or during the Cultural Revolution?
Before the Cultural
mm-hmm.
Revolution. And she also, for a time, she was a fervent supporter of Mao's revolution. At one point, she even called Mao father. Mao was like a father figure to her. But so she had a tortuous sort of intellectual, spiritual journey. She went through a double conversion during her teenage years. She joined the church, became a Christian, was baptized, but then quickly after that, she joined the Communist Revolution, seeing the Communist Revolution as offering at least more concrete solution to the problems of Chinese society, to save the nation. And so, and that continued through the 1950s until the anti-rightist movement, when her dreams in her belief in the Mao Revolution was dashed. But here's the difference. Unlike most Chinese intellectuals at the time, who just after the anti-rightist movement, they went into a mode of self-preservation. Mm-hmm. So silence, at mm-hmm. least, is a mode. She refused to do that. She went on to rebel against this revolution, and starting to write poems, long poems against Mao's revolution. For that, and for participation in an underground journal called Xinhua, mm-hmm. Spark, she was imprisoned. But here again, she differed from other people who, after being thrown into prison, you try to do the best to get out of prison as soon as possible. But she carried on her struggle, her dissent in prison, sometimes resorting to writing in her own blood. That's why it's called Blood Letters. And so when you look into her dissent, eventually she was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for her counter-revolutionary action, but for her refusal to repent, to be reformed. And during the Cultural Revolution, her sentence was changed to a death penalty, and she was executed on April 29, 1968. And so she was executed as a counter-revolutionary, not as a Christian. However, what really inspired and sustained her political dissent was her Christian faith. And I think initially that's something that was overlooked, because there were not enough sources about her what happened behind bars and what went on in her mind. But after I was able to access her prison writings, and so you can see how much faith played into her political dissent, because she saw that as her Christian duty to oppose Mao's totalitarianism, which she calls slavery, and that Christian belief also sort of tempered her dissent. So, for instance, she debated whether opposition can take a non-violent or can take a violent form. She decides that non-violence was the way to oppose the Communist Revolution. So it gave her that willpower, and again a kind of transcendent vision that this is not just a political struggle, a political opposition. This is also a spiritual battle.
I think, I mean, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and helping us think through these things. And it seems like, as I listen to you talk, I think about Liu Xiaobo as well, and Lin Zhao, of course, and how hard it is in China to be a totally moral person. That I feel like so many intellectuals in their daily life have to make compromises all the time. And so I think it's important to kind of surface that and talk about it and examine it, because you know, the compromises you have to make to survive are very, very challenging and you know, understandable. I mean, I think one can forgive that as well, because people need to survive.
Yes. Well, I'm sure everybody in China feels like they have to survive, to make some sort of compromise. Even for the churches, they are willing to make some compromises in order to not get into trouble with the government. But there are points at which they come to certain points beyond which they cannot compromise anymore. For instance, with the churches like Jinminri, Zion Church and other independent churches, when the government wants to install CCTV, closed circuit television, to closely monitor their activities, their offerings, and that when the intrusion went too far, they will refuse to compromise. So I think, again, for people to have the ability to refuse to compromise, to stick to their certain principles, you need some kind of belief system that will transcend the calculations. And Lin Zhao was one who did that. And you know, I'm reminded of lines from T.S. Elliot's Little Gidding. He said, "We only live, only aspire, consumed by either fire or fire." You know, have some kind of a fire that needs to be there, that behind those political actions and choices. And I think religion provides that fire.
Thank you for those final beautiful words. Really appreciate your joining us today to help us consider some very, very complex issues. Thanks so much.
Thank you.